Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, a show that endeavors to bring you the big issues from Canada, the world, right back to our locale here in beautiful British Columbia, Vancouver Island to be specific. And I'm Robin Adair. With me, my co-host with the most, John Jurisic. And John, so excited about BC United. The BC Liberals may soon become another party, or at least another name.
Sounds
BC
like a
United. What do you think?
Sounds like a British football team, doesn't it, Robin?
Well, we could get scarves and we could chant and we could go, this is great. Rob, he's a great striker, that Kevin Falcon. He puts it right in the top corner. It was a cracker. I think it's a great thing for us, I think, to see innovation. I think there's been a big debate for a long time about changing the party name from BC Liberals. We'll see if the party goes for it. I guess they still have a vote ahead whether they go for BC United, but I think it's not a bad idea. But John, let's move on to other things. There's some big news about ArriveCan finally being out the window, the COVID restrictions being lifted.
Robin, I recently had an elderly relative travel. This ArriveCan app drove them nuts, okay? The whole idea of this ArriveCan app was potentially, in my personal opinion, wrong-headed for many older Canadians who are fully vaccinated, but they can't use the internet. It's struggle. It was a struggle for me to help my elderly relative. It's been a major hassle for them at the airport. ArriveCan is now optional. Plus, the rest of the world has now moved on. I mean, that's one of the biggest determinants. It's accepted in most countries that it's your individual responsibility now to get vaccinated or not. Of course, if you choose not to get the shot, good luck. And you've accepted that potentially COVID can hit you a lot harder. But that's what we call making an adult decision. And we need to now transfer authority back to the adults in the room, Robin.
I agree with that, John, and I'm a little tired of having the powers from above tell me how I should behave. I believe in vaccinations. I'm fully vaccinated. I also believe in taking precautions. Of course, if you're going to be out there and traveling around and you have a head cold or maybe the flu or whatever else you might have, I think it's incumbent on you to wear a mask. I think you should be responsible to your fellow passenger and your fellow Canadians. And let's hope that people continue to do that now that the regulations have been lifted. And enough of that now, John, as we move to viewer mail. We've got lots of viewer mail to talk about.
And do we ever? That is certainly something that's exploded on the VRR recently. We get mail from across the country, Robin. We've really touched a nerve in the wake of the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Our viewers were particularly fired up when we had monarchist and lawyer Bruce Halser on our show recently saying Canada needs to retain the current monarchy under King Charles, as the Crown adds stability to our parliamentary system. I agree with that. Well, clearly not everyone does, Robin. Tina writes, get rid of the monarchy. Such a waste of money. And they mean nothing to the majority of Canadians.
And Larry also chimes in, personally, I feel Canada should remain a member of the Commonwealth. Just saying.
And Marcel writes to us, Canadians should decide about the monarch in the next election votes.
And Dean observes, the Constitution cannot be changed. It would take every province and territory plus all Aboriginal leaders to agree 100%, plus 70% of the members of the Senate. Believe me, it'll never happen. And I want to thank everyone for joining us on the Rumble Room in this way, and we appreciate hearing from our viewers. It's great to get perspectives from coast to coast, and of course BC and our island home. It's great to hear from so many people. Keep the mail coming. And from that, John, now we are going to leap across to civic politics.
I'm involved in some campaigns locally. I am shocked at some of the dialogue between candidates that's online. They're not playing very nicely in the municipal sandbox, Robin. Signs are being knocked down. Signs are being stolen. I don't know where all these signs are going. And they're being defaced. I've got to say that I really admire and respect the candidates who are taking the high road with this. After all, this sort of thing happens with every election. Here's an example in Saanich of the right attitude. Mayoral candidate Dean Murdoch has a giant smile on his face as he pokes his head through his damaged campaign sign. That was really fun to see. Good for him. He's campaigning to be mayor on issues like safer roads, more affordable housing. But people, they really do remember images. They do remember these little clips. And it is a lighthearted image, and it will be remembered as any policy issue.
I tend to agree with that, John. And I know that the actual incumbent mayor of Saanich, Fred Haynes, obviously feels the same way, as he has been campaigning very hard on issues like new parks and safer sidewalks, but he's also having some fun. For example, this little video he did trying to get out people supporting the bat vote.
Hey there, so here we are putting up some bat houses. We have 2 to put up behind the hedge here for bat habitat. We're just down at the Colquitts and Cuthbert Holmes Park, seeing the bat houses there. We're seeing them around Saanich. We got these a while ago, made by local craftsmen. Up they go. Let's support our bat community.
Robin, I've stated as long as I've been on the show and before, I appreciate folks taking a more personal and human approach to politics. I really think that resonates. This can be a terribly nasty game, as it's being demonstrated currently, and we'd all benefit from people taking the high road and treating each other like with some respect. But then again, sometimes civic officials get a little carried away with themselves, Robin. They get way out of their lane. Like this announcement that the city of Victoria is finally returning the statue of Sir John A MacDonald to the society that donated it. About time. You may recall, if you've forgotten that set of activities 4 years ago, Mayor Lisa Helps pulled together a small working group she called the Family, many of which had no idea what that means. And this group arbitrarily decided to remove the likeness of Canada's first Prime Minister from the entrance to City Hall.
The whole purpose of removing the statue from the front steps of City Hall, safely storing it in a city facility, is so we can have a conversation with the community and with the nations about how best to tell the complex story and the complex history of John A. MacDonald, and in what context, in what public space is the statue best suited to be, and what else needs to be there with it.
So a decision by the so-called family, which included members of Victoria Council and also representatives of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And fair enough, they made a decision, but I don't believe that they had very much input from the wider community. And reconciliation offered as the main reason for doing this. And the government back in the 1800s, that was led by Sir John A. MacDonald. They did indeed bring in the Indian Act and did introduce the whole idea of residential schools. So Sir John A. MacDonald was a man of his time. And he was also a major force in bringing Canada together as a country coast to coast. And they've now branded him, particularly Victoria Council have branded him unfit for public display. And the question from the MacDonald Laurier Institute, is this all leading to true reconciliation?
I believe the current campaign of vilification and erasure being carried out against Sir John A. MacDonald, architect of Confederation and our first Prime Minister, is both wrong and unjustified. On the other hand, I warmly welcome the desire for reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples that justifies this campaign in the minds of many people of goodwill. Can the desire to celebrate the history of perhaps the finest country in the world and that of seeking reconciliation with Indigenous people who feel wronged by that history be made to coexist? I believe that they can, and that we should try. Remembering that the most recent attack on Sir John's reputation was the removal of his statue from the City Hall in Victoria, BC, in the name of reconciliation. A need for understanding, but not for vengeance. A need for reparation, but not for retaliation. A need for kindness, but not for victimization. As one acute observer explained, what Truth and Reconciliation Commissions seek to undo is the deep-rooted human need for vengeance as a means to address past wrongs.
We've seen plenty of destruction of monuments and statues over the past couple of years, not just in Canada, right across North America. Some of this, the decisions of civic councils in the name of reconciliation, and some of it in violent anger coming from young people, some of them First Nations, who feel Canada has exploited them. Here are a few examples. In June of 2021, Sir John A MacDonald statue was taken by the city of Kingston, MacDonald's hometown. In Kitchener, in the wake of graves found at residential schools, red paint was splashed on Queen Victoria. And in Winnipeg, activists ripped Queen Victoria's head off her statue after they pulled it down in fury and amidst red paint.
You know, John, there has to be a way to reach some sort of consensus about how to examine our history and do this without all of this destruction and arbitrary decision-making. Certainly, nobody wants to suggest that Indigenous people didn't have a tough time when the Europeans first arrived, and since they basically took hold of North America. Over the years, European travelers and traders and settlers brought disease and wiped out much of the Indigenous population. Surviving Indigenous people were placed on reserves and their traditions were discouraged, their children forced to attend residential schools. There's no doubt that people in Sir John A MacDonald's time, including Sir John A, judged Indigenous people to be illiterate inferiors. And this stigma has been a blight on our society as a result.
On the other hand, there's no doubt that Sir John A is the reason we're not Americans today. And thank you for that. MacDonald found a way to work with French Canada to bring together a united Dominion. And then he pushed for the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which ensured that Canada would include the Prairie Provinces and British Columbia. MacDonald even came out to Victoria to bring local colonial officials on side to join Confederation, not the United States. Thank you once again. To cap it off, Sir John A even served one term as the member for Victoria in the House of Commons. Nonetheless, from 3,000 miles away, wonder if he used the internet at that time. He was an important man of his time. No, he was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. However, does that form the criteria for judging his legacy and shoving it in a box?
Well, you know, looking at the demands of Victoria City Hall as they returned the MacDonald statue, you'd think MacDonald was despicable. You really would. I mean, here are some of the things that Victoria City Hall spelt out to the MacDonald Society. And this was all approved by council by a vote of 7-1. And here it says, the Historical Society will not permit the statue to be displayed anywhere on Vancouver Island without approval from local First Nations.
Any public statements would be highly supportive of the reconciliation process. These statements will be coordinated by the Mayor of Victoria and the Esquimalt and Songhees nations.
It is the intention of the Society to safeguard the statue, not seek a place of public display.
And finally, hard to read these, if the Society allows a public display, it will use its best efforts to include the fullest possible educational information of his times, his policies, and their consequences. You know, I actually agree with the last point, Robin. It would be good to include information about both sides of MacDonald's legacy, both good and bad. But they couldn't have done this in the first place, really, and left his statue alone and asked for more community input. Hello?
You'd think that would be the logical step, and I hope we're learning from some of these things. We certainly are learning about it on this program, John, and we thought we'd ask somebody who specialized in historic figures to chime in. Ken Lane was once the man in charge of the Royal London Wax Museum downtown, and today there is a coffee shop at the former steamship building, but for decades there's beautiful figures, wax figures on display, including the British royal family. The Wax Museum lost its lease over a decade ago. The question comes to mind, are wax figures and public statues and monuments, for that matter, no longer relevant? Have they in fact become unloved symbols of past misdeeds? Ken Lane has kindly agreed to come on and talk about historic figures and how they are viewed in society today. Let's zoom him in. And now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room for the first time, the man who was at the helm up until the end of the Royal London Wax Museum in Victoria's Inner Harbor, Ken Lane. Ken, so great to have you on the program.
Gentlemen, nice to be here.
And I'm loving the getup. It's great. You got the top hat, and maybe explain what the other garb is about.
This is the 100th anniversary of the poppy, and so we're starting to see images like this vest and bow tie of the poppy, and they'll probably be seen with increasing frequency as we get towards November the 11th.
Well, we love breaking stuff, so that's good to know that. Thanks, Ken, for thinking of that. You know, we are very concerned about some of the things we're seeing right now in the world, and particularly in Canada. We're seeing statues damaged, defiled, and pulled down across the country because there are people out there that actually believe that Sir John A MacDonald, Queen Victoria, and even Queen Elizabeth stand for colonialism and stand against Indigenous people. In your mind, what do you think of this?
It's hard to know how far afield to take this. There's so many observations about what's going on, such as Thomas Sowell out of the US. He said, it's amazing today that we are holding people who are no longer alive for crimes we thought they committed, yet the crimes being committed today are not being held to, not being called to the courts or the justice system. It's just a weird system. It's upside down. But you take it back a little bit further, and these things have happened in the past. And when we did our storytelling in the Wax Museum, Henry VIII was always one of the more popular tales. And Henry VIII undertook a kind of a same kind of thing when he was changing England from the Catholic Church to the Anglican Church, and it was called the dissolution of the monasteries. He was not only eliminating the Catholic Church from England, he was also looking for more money to keep his ambitious ideas for being a king alive and cooking. So he greatly improved his cash flow and his asset base by dissolution of the monasteries. So there was a reason behind what he was doing. What's happening today, there's a reason behind it, but it's hard to identify it without being accused of going into conspiracy theories, because they're hard to prove. But there are a number of them out there.
But I would imagine if you had Sir John A MacDonald on display at your wax museum, you'd probably try to show both sides of his legacy. It wouldn't just be, I'm standing in praise of him. Here are some of the things perhaps that were unhappy that happened during his tenure as prime minister in regards to the Indian Act and residential schools. But to tar and feather him at this stage, when he is the person who really helped build the country, I would think as a historian and somebody who's worked around this industry for such a long time, you must be troubled by this, Ken.
Well, I'm troubled a bit, and at least partly because of the knowledge of Canadian history that we do have through the Wax Museum. And we have been asked, Daphne and I have been asked to portray Sir John A MacDonald and his second wife, Agnes, at different events. And most recently, we did that at the grand reopening of the Saanich Pioneer Log Cabin Museum out in Saanishton. And the conversations were incredible, how people were respectful and admiring of the legacy that John A. MacDonald left. And if you study his life, he was an incredibly strong family man. He was so much to so many, a remarkable individual. And of course, mistakes are made, but you know, the old saying is that he who is without sin be the first one to cast a stone. We are human, and we certainly, but there's a lot in his legacy that only John A. MacDonald could do, and only because he was Scottish. And it's incredible, the Scottish influence that got Canada going, and John A. was part of that.
Ken, as a kid growing up in Victoria, 10 years ago,
Maybe 11.
Hey, I loved going through the Wax Museum, and certainly we had visitors coming in from town and parts of other parts of the country and beyond. We'd often make the Wax Museum one of our critical, essential stops. They closed you down now over a decade ago. And really, in my opinion, arguably, I suspect, but anyway, they really haven't found a better use of that old CPR building to date. Was it short-sighted to close your museum? Have wax figures gone out of style?
I think it was a lot more to do with political correctness than the Wax Museum itself. People like Robin Blanco in the Davy Barrett NDP days were very harsh or very determined that the Wax Museum should leave what was a private sector building that was now a public sector building. And because he didn't feel it was appropriate for citizens who owned the building to have to pay admission fee to get into it. So we were under the gun from David Barrett's NDP way back when. And then they started getting a little bit politically correct with regards to royalty. They started this story or the belief that Victoria shouldn't be known as a little bit of Old England, because it isn't really. And we lost, even Tourism Victoria got onto that particular bandwagon. But you talk to the people around the world who used to market, or still do market, Visit Canada, and back in the previous century, the easiest cities in Canada to market were Quebec City and Victoria, because they had an image that everyone could understand and envision. And Victoria walked away from it. It just literally turned it down and walked away from it. And yeah, from my perspective, that's a mistake. And because we were the Royal London Wax Museum and center scene was British royalty, it was not politically correct. So being a private business in a public building was one strike, and now representing the royalty and showing the royalty was also not politically correct. So there was a definite behind the scenes movement to oust the Wax Museum from its location. And they were finally able to do it with funding coming from the federal government.
It's interesting to see what's happened to the Wax Museum in some ways being replicated at the Royal British Columbia Museum, where they've managed now with the new people at the top to basically shut down the whole third floor of the Royal BC Museum. They were going to close the whole museum and tear it down until the province kind of rose up in anger about the thing. And then John Horgan, I think, wisely backed off. But they haven't reopened the third floor. They are recasting what they believe we should be learning about Canadian history. They don't think the old town should be represented. They don't like colonialism. They don't like a settler culture. The fact that the vast majority of us came to this beautiful province, at least our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents did that, and we are the majority, the vast majority, and that somehow that's being besmirched, and we're supposed to feel badly about that heritage. While I'm all for celebrating our Indigenous people, can't we celebrate everybody? But that doesn't seem to be the way it's going right now in museums, Ken.
Well, my own understanding of the situation is because the Indigenous folks are a pathway to the federal government funding. That is why there's such an emphasis on the Indigenous culture and structures and so on, because the more Indigenous you bring into your city or your town or your community, you could get a siphon pathway into funds from Ottawa. And I think that's got a lot to do with why we're seeing the emphasis on the First Nations folks.
Right. Ken, just a sort of variation of that comment and question. You in fact had the entire royal family on display at your Wax Museum, including Queen Elizabeth II, a younger version of our now new king, Charles III. I imagine many people who came through your facility loved seeing those figures. How do you think the public today is viewing all of this heritage destruction and dismissal of our history? For example, the bust of Queen Elizabeth in Beacon Hill Park is now headless. Do you think this kind of behavior hurts our cultural identity and therefore our national pride? Does reconciliation, in fact, mean that we can no longer be proud of our heritage?
To me, it suggests a lot of instability. And in addition to the other unstable factors that are happening in and around the lower BC mainland, I think it impacts tourism and visitor confidence in visiting this area significantly. So to me, that's a significant factor. We're not the welcoming, open, friendly, safe destinations that we once were. And it's you see it even in people not going downtown Victoria anymore. And I'm one of them. Very rarely do I go downtown Victoria anymore, and I used to work there. It's just not. In fact, I was there yesterday to drop off to check with some of Devon Properties people, and it was Monday, and I was on Fort Street, and it looked like it was out of a third world country because a lot of the stores weren't open on Monday. And all the ones that were closed had these big iron gates and padlocks and chain link fences, and all kinds of things in front of them. It is not a pleasant experience to visit downtown Victoria.
So great to hear from Ken Lane, fellow chamber board members from what seems like 1,000 years ago. Not really, Ken, not really. I really hope Canadians will one day learn to celebrate the men and the women and the communities and the people who built this country, warts and all. And perhaps when we reach that day, maybe we'll then actually truly understand and arrive at real reconciliation.
Hear, hear, John. And when you stack up Canada's problems to other parts of the world, some of this seems, well, not unimportant, but it diminishes when you put it up against situations like they're dealing with right now, say in Russia and Ukraine, where people are dying every day in a terrible, violent conflict caused by Vladimir Putin, as he recruits another 300,000 in the latest mobilization for the Ukrainian front. And many of these poor Russians that are being pulled out and pulled away by their families come from some of the more desperate areas of Soviet influence, like Dagestan, which is in southern Russia, where mothers and wives could be heard shouting, "No to war." And John, we're very excited. Next week, we've got an expert on Russia coming on the program, someone who has actually personally met Vladimir Putin and has a real handle on the mindset of the Russians today and where this conflict in Ukraine may be going. Looking forward to that. But now it's just about time to wrap up the show, John. So if you could again kindly tell our valued viewers how they can follow the Rumble Room, support the Rumble Room, be part of our Rumble Room family. And there's so many different ways and iterations.
Robin, I'm so excited for the Rumble Room to be reaching right into the heart of Moscow. That's what we do around here. And what we really do around here is value everybody's comments and everybody watching us, because there's a ton of you. And they can be doing that through our Facebook page, through our Twitter page, and of course, our YouTube page, as well as our Instagram, TikTok, and news group page. So many cool, fun ways to watch this show. But for now, they won't be putting up any statues to me at any time soon, I don't think, Robin. But I remain, however, your statuesque Croatian sensation, Johnny Juricic.
And I might have even said Rubenesque. I might have said Rubenesque. But I'd also say, let's go, let's go. BC United, BC United. Still sounds like a soccer team. Anyway, I'm Robin Adair, and Rumble on.
And go!